This is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. In the conversation that follows, you will hear Frank Kelly, a vice president of the center, talk with Rex Tugwell. Younger people may be only vaguely familiar with his name, but to anyone over 40, the name Rex Tugwell belongs to history. Together with Raymond Moley and A. Burley, Rex Tugwell made up the original brains trust that assisted Franklin Delano Roosevelt before and after his election to the presidency in 1932. Professor Tugwell tells about those days in his book, The Enlargement of the Presidency. After serving the Roosevelt administration in a number of capacities, Mr. Tugwell became governor of Puerto Rico. It was during his tenure that territory, once a bitterly impoverished and hopeless land, began its exceptional economic and political progress. Mr. Tugwell, who has participated in many of the Center's conferences in the past, was in residence at the Center in part of 1964 and 1965. As could be expected, the staff not only drew upon his experience during our daily meetings, but enjoyed talking with him informally, too, as he reminisced about his New Deal experiences. The conversation that follows was recorded shortly before the election of President Johnson. But we felt some of the questions raised, as for example, is it the President's duty to instruct the electorate even at the risk of losing votes, were still pertinent. Frank Kelly begins.
There's something that Mr. Burley said at one of our first meetings when we were trying to work out the program for the Center that impressed me. And as I recall it, Burley said we were discussing the presidency. And Mr. Burley astonished me, perhaps not Mr. Hutchins or the others there, by saying, well, the thing that I finally learned from Roosevelt was, Roosevelt told me there are relatively few times when the president can really exert his power, and he has to know exactly when he can do it. And in spite of the fact he's surrounded with all these outward elements of power, he still, in a very curious way, is restricted somehow. Do you have that feeling?
Oh, yes, very much so. I think anyone does who really studies the presidency. Curious thing about it is that most people who have become president haven't known this until they became, even if they've been in the Senate, for instance. They don't seem to know this.
So when you're outside of the White House, you think, my heavens, there's tremendous power there, almost unlimited power. And then when they get in, they find
well, that's probably because Americans have such a concentration on their president and tend to dignify him so much. They forget that he's surrounded by almost equal powers, or perhaps powers which are more than equal in the other branches of the government, not to speak of the civilian powers with whom he has to deal.
Yes. Well, you've been concerned with this question of power and how you exercise it for the public good in many capacities. I was fascinated by your discussion of your experiences when you were head of the New York City Planning Commission. What do you think, looking back on your experiences, is the hardest thing to communicate to people in a democratic society about power? I know there's some people who feel that it's evil in itself. Friends of mine, when I worked for the Senate Policy Committee in Washington, they said, how could you get into politics? You know, it's just a matter of throat cutting and wielding power, naked power, and there's something evil about that. What do you think about these?
Well, there's nothing more evil inherently about it. There's a great deal to be said, I think, about the ethics of politics. Most professional politicians recognize quite a definite system of ethics. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they recognize it in the reverse way. That is to say, they show that they know about it by violating its principles, you know. But this is like any person who sins. I mean, if he knows
that he's a sinner.
If he knows that he sins, he recognizes the moral code, you see. And this is true among politicians. So it is true that politicians are often faced with the decision whether they will do something which, as individuals, they wouldn't do.
That's right.
In order to gain a political point. That is, and the political point to be gained, of course, is usually an election.
Yeah. It becomes that they almost become two persons, a public person and a private person.
They do.
I noticed that among all the senators I met.
They do.
You talk to them privately, and they'd say, oh, gee, that was a horrible bill, but we had to get something through,
yes,
so I supported it. You know?
That's right, and, well, I remember one particular occasion, and Burley and I spoke to each other about it afterwards and discussed the ethical point some. And I've forgotten what we were talking about with President Roosevelt, or he wasn't president yet, but this was when he was a candidate. about something that we thought he ought to say. And he said, well, I'm not going to say that. And we said, well, we still think that you should. And he said, well, you young men should remember that none of the things that you want to get done are going to get done unless I'm elected. And he said, I'm the fellow that knows how to get elected. Well, we couldn't say anything about that. I mean, this was his choice to make.
Yeah. I ran into exactly the same thing, put in almost the same way, when I was working for Senator Lucas in 1950. He was running for re-election against Everett Dirksen, and I thought he should say certain things or take certain positions, and he said to me, I'm the man the people elected, and I have to present myself in a way in which I think will appeal to the voters. Well, in that case, he was wrong. He got beaten. In your case, Roosevelt was right.
Yes, this doesn't mean that they're always right about this.
But this is the thing that's in the forefront of their mind.
That's right. And from their point of view, it's the thing that has to stay in the forefront of their mind.
By the way, while we're on this subject, I'd be interested in your comments on a column by Robert Hutchins that appeared in the paper yesterday, in which he advised President Johnson, since he said that everyone agreed that Johnson was practically elected, to take up certain very unpopular issues, such as acknowledging the idea of peaceful existence with the communists and doing something about the Negro Revolution and on a big scale and so on, saying that it was the duty of the president to conduct an educational campaign. What do you think about that?
Well, I was very much interested in this column and in a way amused, because this is almost exactly the same thing that Burley and I were telling President Roosevelt.
Well, that's what made me think of it.
Yes, and what you run into there is something which all politicians have to decide who get to the point of being elected to anything, and this is whether they will decide that they are going to get a mandate, or whether they will decide that they're not, and going to spread themselves and compromise so that nobody has anything against them, you see?
Yeah. This is the choice the president faces.
Yes, well, we had this argument with Roosevelt about this, and we said, well, it's important for you to get elected from our point of view, but you always have to ask yourself what you want to get elected for.
Right.
It's not just so that you can be president. It's so that you can be president to do something. And he laughed about this and said, well, of course, he said, I feel the same way about it. And we said, well, then there is this question of how much compromise you're going to make. Because we know perfectly well that you think the most important part of a president's duty is what Mr. Hutchins said, is to educate people. And President Roosevelt, on a very famous occasion afterwards, said exactly the same. The most important thing a president has to do is to exercise leadership, and be an educator and a moral leader. And we knew this from talking to him before, that this was the way he felt. And yet, in the campaign of 1932, he wasn't running that way.
He was running to get every vote he could get.
He was running to get every vote he could get and to offend no one. And while you can say, looking back over that 1932 campaign, that in a way he hinted at most of the things that came out in the New Deal afterward, he was very distinctly not offending anybody except those people who, as a result of the Depression and what had happened during the Depression, were on everybody's mind anyway, as almost criminals. Bankers were in very bad order those days, for instance, and financiers in general.
Yes, they made a big comeback.
And so he didn't hesitate to criticize them. But
he didn't mind kicking around people he thought were very unpopular.
No, not if he agreed.
But still, it seems to me that there's a tremendously important issue here, whether a presidential campaign should be an educational experience for the people, or simply an exercise.
Yes, you're quite right.
See how many votes can be piled up here and how many over there.
I said I was amused by this column of Mr. Hutchins, and what amused me about it, apart from its importance, was that he began by saying that Johnson is practically elected anyway, you see?
No president would make that assumption, I don't think. If I were Johnson, I wouldn't.
This was a practical admission on Mr. Hutchins' part that if it was a close campaign, he obviously couldn't do it. But since it wasn't, he could, you see?
Yes.
Well, we thought this was the same way in 1932 because we had, Louis Howe had made his famous remark about halfway through the campaign. Well, he said, this is the year when we could elect a Chinaman.
That's right.
You know?
I think it's probably true.
And so we said, well, if you're going to be elected anyway, let's get out in front, and
educate the people.
Educate the people. But there was something else that Burley and I didn't understand about this, which I understand now, and it came to me gradually and afterwards. The president wasn't, we'll say, trimming. He wasn't compromising just because of his desire to be elected. He was trimming and compromising and getting to, well, what you might call a least common denominator, because he felt he had a contract with the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And the Democratic Party, in his mind at that time, were the people who had supported and put him forward and got him nominated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was people like Senator Hall, Burns, all that.
He was loyal to his friends, and he wanted to.
Yes, they
thought he had an obligation.
They had been putting him forward for several years, mm-hmm. and it was they who had written the platform. Mm-hmm. It was they who had supported Roosevelt all through that spring and into the convention, and stood by him during the convention.
And was their advice on the cautious side?
It wasn't their advice on the cautious side. It was their ideas about what the Democratic Party stood for, you see.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And these were, as you'd expect, rather old-fashioned liberal ideas.
Yes.
They weren't radical, and they weren't forward-looking at all. They were people, they were, like low tariff and
yes.
so on.
Foreign trade, reciprocal trade, and so on.
He had already made... He'd already made one change which they didn't like. You see, most of these people reached back to Wilsonian days, mm-hmm. and they had practically all of them been strong supporters of the League of Nations.
Yes.
But Roosevelt, somewhat earlier, had been under attack by Hearst on this. Hearst, you see, was an isolationist. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt, way back in January of 1932, had repudiated the League. And this had infuriated these senators, of course, and they'd come down on him. All the old group, including Colonel House, for instance. Mm-hmm. So he had gone about as far as he could in offending this group, and he had taken some pains to smooth them over and say that it was only the old League of Nations that he was talking about. He wasn't against world organization in general. And of course, he proved that in the long run.
When he helped to set up the United Nations. Well, now, but Lyndon Johnson, I think, is in a peculiarly different position from any presidential candidate in many years.
That's right.
Because the Democratic Convention at Atlantic City was just a one-man performance. There wasn't any group that Lyndon Johnson owes his nomination to.
But you know, the reason I think Lyndon Johnson doesn't do what Hutchins suggested, if I may.
Yes, I'd like to hear your comment.
We're getting into contemporary politics.
Well, this is good. I think it'd be interesting to people to hear.
Well, I think that, I think for one thing, he has had his training in the legislative branch. Mm-hmm. And he was a very good leader of the legislative branch. I never heard him make the slightest suggestion of any reform in the legislative branch, which most of us political scientists and outsiders and so on all think is necessary. Yes. I never heard him make any such suggestion at all. Mm-hmm. And that may be because he was so caught up in it,
Yes. I imagine he'd have a few reforms in mind now that he's been in the presidency.
Of the Congress?
Yes, he might. I mean,
well, I feel sure that he will after a while in the presidency, but I don't see any sign that he's got to it yet.
Yes, but why would this make him feel that he couldn't adopt the Hutchins suggestions? The fact that he did.
Well, because certainly some of the reforms that Hutchins would like to see carried out would be governmental ones, you see. Mm-hmm. And I think that Johnson is so much a workman in the government workshop that
he's been so successful in making it work, too.
He doesn't, yes, and been so successful in making it work that he doesn't see it from perspective that those of us who have been in it and gotten out and looked back on it and so on do see it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Well, now, you've been in the governmental process not only as an academician, as an advisor to a president, but as a practical governor of Puerto Rico. Could you tell us some of your experiences?
Well,
in that?
I'd like to go back to the second point I was going to make about this
yes.
first. The second
Go ahead.
reason why I think Johnson hasn't done what Hutchins suggested. The first is that he is caught up in the governmental machinery, knows how to work it, and likes to do that kind of thing. This is obviously, with him, a real workmanlike job.
It's fascinating to him,
Fascinating to him. But the other thing is that Johnson was born and brought up in the New Deal. He started out as administrator of the Youth Administration in Texas, and this got him elected to Congress. And when he was in Congress, he was the chief supporter of the early New Deal measures for the Rural Electrification Administration and Social Security and all the rest of it.
Yes.
He's a real old-fashioned New Dealer. Well, now, when Roosevelt got through, the New Deal agenda was far from completed. There were a lot of things that still should be done. And they weren't done under Truman because Truman had immediately fell into fight with the Congress, and Truman never got anything through the Congress on the domestic side.
Yeah.
He did some very important things, like the
Foreign
Truman
affairs.
Doctrine and so on, but on the domestic side, he never got anything done. And Kennedy didn't either. After 8 years of Eisenhower, Kennedy made a lot of suggestions, but he was never able to tear them loose. Well, now Johnson has been able to tear them loose and get them done, and he's coming to the end of an agenda that's really a Rooseveltian agenda.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. He's gone back and picked up all those old New
And
Deal
now
measures.
these are getting all done. If he gets Medicare through, for instance, now he will have really have completed the agenda.
Finish the New Deal.
Yeah, finished the New Deal. And now it's got to be something entirely different, something new, you
Yes,
see.
yeah.
And I don't think he's got it. I mean, I don't think he's
thought about it.
He may have thought about it, but I don't see any suggestion that he sees any great new things ahead.
Well, he talks about the Great
He
Society.
talks about the Great Society, but I haven't seen any indication of what the Great Society is, except a few things, such as the enlargement of various things that have already been started, such as reconstruction of the cities, and all that has to do with welfare and so on. But these are really just extensions of the New Deal.
Of course, it's quite possible that enlargement and refinement and reform of the New Deal would carry us for a good many years.
Oh, yes, that's right. But the president, who's going to run again, and especially the next fellow who's going to pick it up, have got to have some issue, and some constructive issue.
Of course, the ideas Hutchins put forward would be revolutionary in Johnson's eyes, I would think, in many respects.
Well, you see, this is going beyond Kennedy's New Frontier. You see,
Yeah.
this is out there in the blue,
Yeah,
and needs to be defined.
yeah.
Institutions like this institution here are the ones who will formulate
What the
what
coming presidents will
what
do.
comes next, what lies out there in the blue for people in this new age that we're
Well, I
moving
hope-
into so rapidly.
I hope we can do a good job of defining it. It's a very difficult one. Now, going back to another aspect of the political life that you've had, as I said, you were governor of Puerto Rico. Could you tell us something about that experience, what it meant to you?
Well, in a way that was much more satisfactory than working in the federal government, and because you could have some sense of accomplishment. When you're working in the federal government in Washington, you work in an office and have a lot of people around and sign a lot of papers, but you never see anything gets done.
That's true.
It's too far away, both in time and in distance, you know. And well, that isn't absolutely true, but there isn't
Puerto
a
Rico is a
there isn't
smaller
a sense
area.
of immediate accomplishment that you get in a place like Puerto Rico. For instance, one of the things, when I was going down to be governor, I said to the president, I said, anything you particularly want to tell me? And he said, yes. He said, you get those people a decent water supply so you can drink water out of the tap. He said, that'd be the greatest thing you could do down there. Well, I kind of laughed, you know. I thought this was kind of trivial.
Very basic.
But when I got down there, I discovered that nearly half the children died before they were a year old of dysentery.
Sure.
And this was bad water. So
Nearly half the children.
Yes.
Good Lord.
So I began to inquire, and lots of older people inquired. Dysentery was chief cause of death and sickness. So I got down there and I began to inquire why this was, and I discovered that all the city and village water supplies were controlled by the politicians. And this was a chief source of patronage. And they had a lot of people who were supposed to be tending to the water supply, but actually they were out doing political work. And if there was a holiday, they didn't put any chlorine in the reservoir, you see. And,
Just forgot about it.
So there'd be an epidemic immediately following it, all of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I decided the only way to do this was to make to do what was quite obvious, that is to make the water supply an insular supply, not a municipal one. Divided up into the 30 or more municipalities that the country had. And so we formed a water authority.
For the entire Commonwealth.
For the entire Commonwealth, and got the engineers to work on it, got consulting engineers from the states, and in a few years we had the best water supply you ever heard of.
How'd you get around the politicians?
Well, this was quite a difficult fight. And it was complicated by the fact that the man I worked with in Puerto Rico, who was Munoz Marin, who afterwards succeeded me as governor.
Yes, I was going to ask you about him.
Was elected in the election of 1940 to be a senator, and then became president of the Senate. But he didn't have an absolute majority in that election, and the resident commissioner, who was elected at the same time, belonged to the opposition. So we had a man in Washington who was against the administration in Puerto Rico. And he was against me, too, because I was working with Munoz Marin. And then when I attempted to take the patronage of the water supply away from him, which was one of his chief political assets in Puerto Rico, he was furious. Well, I give you my word that there was hardly a day for more than a year in Washington when he didn't denounce Tugwell as a Red and a communist, and this was all because I was trying to reform the water supply in Puerto Rico. This and other things resulted in 2 or 3 congressional investigations.
Yes, I remember some of the headlines
in Puerto Rico. And of course the water supply was never mentioned. Many other things were mentioned, but never the water supply, which was back of it. But we got the good water supply, and I often tell myself that there are probably 500,000 people who are alive now who wouldn't have been alive if I hadn't made this fight. This may be not something to be altogether proud of, because Puerto Rico was pretty crowded. But
yes, you contributed to the population explosion.
Yes, I figure when they talk about the population explosion, I feel a little, a little self-conscious.
No, I think it's a wonderful thing for any man to be able to sit quietly and say, as you did, I think there are 500,000 people alive today because of that fight I made.
Well, I think
that's a marvelous thing.
I think it's true. I think that the water supply would have been reformed sometime, but maybe not for quite a while.
Certainly speeded it up.
Yeah. Well, we did the same thing with the other utilities too. We made the power public, and
we laid the groundwork for the whole development of Puerto Rico as a modern state.
We did, and we did it in the first year of the war, 1942, when everything was boiling around us.
How long were you governor there?
5 years. I was a strictly war governor, 1941 to 1946.
Well, you mentioned Munoz Marin. I saw the other day that he's retiring finally. He's been governor ever since you were governor, hasn't he?
Well, there was an interim governor for 2 years.
Well, lots of people like to give you the credit, or some people give you the blame for the career of Munoz Marin. You were sort of encouraged him to...
No, he was elected in 1940 before I went down there to be president of the Senate. And he was the big political leader before that. And I think we did, during those years, reinforce each other.
You paved the way for his becoming governor, and for the establishment of the election of a governor rather than the appointment of a governor.
That's right. We worked together during those years. We had a great many differences, of course. In the early years, he had great difficulty bringing himself to understand and appreciate administration.
He's a fiery fellow, a poet, isn't he?
Yes, he was. He came from the legislative branch, and he didn't have any sympathy with my ideas about reforming the administration of government But because he needed me for other things, I could insist on those. And Puerto Rico does have a good government.
Well, did Munoz Marin become a good administrator finally?
Yes, he did.
He settled down.
When he became governor, he discovered that he had to pay attention to administration, and he did a very good job of it. Because he's a very intelligent person. And
he's always interested me because, to me, he's an example of the mysterious nature of man. As I recall it, he was a sort of a Greenwich Village character at one time, laid around New York, drinking and writing poetry and strumming on the guitar or something, and then all of a sudden he emerges as a great political leader. How do you account for things like that?
Well, his father was a great political leader in Puerto Rico. And when he went back to Puerto Rico, he was at one time elected to the legislature in Puerto Rico, and it sort of didn't take. I mean, he wasn't able to do anything. And,
sort of a playboy, wasn't he?
They were more senior people, and the parties were pretty decayed and pretty corrupt. And he didn't see any chance of working through any of the parties as they existed then. So what he finally did when he decided that he wanted his future to be political and not literary or something else, he went back to Puerto Rico and sort of retreated into the woods and began to build up a party out of the, mostly of what in Puerto Rico are called the Jibaros, that is the small farmers.
The shirtless ones?
Yes, they would be somewhere else. But the Jibaro means farmer.
The small farmer.
The small farmer.
Probably the most poverty-stricken group in Puerto Rico.
Yes, that's right, and this was his source of political strength in his first few elections. And his reforms were of the sort that were intended to build up Puerto Rico well-being. Conditions were terrible in those days for poor people in Puerto Rico. They're pretty good now.
Puerto Rico is, I think, a shining example in Latin America, although I found that a lot of Latin Americans I've talked to won't accept Puerto Rico as a Latin American country.
You know the reason for that, don't you?
Well, they feel the United States has sort of changed the whole character.
Well, it's partly that, but also they have this deep feeling that in Puerto Rico there was never a revolution.
Well, it was all done peacefully.
Puerto Rico was a loyalist country all through the revolutions of the 19th century.
Well, it's probably the reforms that people put in that...
Oh, yes. I attach no importance whatever to this, but Latin Americans bring this up, you know.
They've got to have some revolutions.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you know, you've had such a wide variety of experience about things. I'd like to ask you, just as a closing question, if you'd give me your deepest feeling about the potentialities of human beings, what do you think is the future of man in the 20th century? I know that's a very broad question, but are you hopeful, pessimistic, or how would you describe your feeling about the future?
I'm afraid that I come close to being a professional optimist. I don't worry about any of the things that most people do. I don't worry about the population explosion, and I don't worry about poverty, and I don't worry about race, and I don't worry about any of these things that we're talking about now, except in a temporary way. I like to join in all kinds of movements, such as the movement to bring up the Negro race to a situation of equality and all of these things, but I don't really worry about it because I think they're inevitable. And I think that the things that are happening in the scientific world and in the world of public administration are going to solve all of these problems without fail. I don't see how people can be so concerned as they are about the future when it's so magnificent. I often tell my wife if I could only live 50 years longer to see some of these things happen.
Well, that's a great way to feel.
Well, I think I enjoy looking at the future a great deal more than the pessimists do, at least.
You certainly do. Well, thank you ever so much. I've enjoyed talking with you, Mr. Tugwell.
You have been listening to Frank Kelly, Vice President of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, talk with Rexford Tugwell, former governor of Puerto Rico. Mr. Tugwell's book, How They Became President, will shortly be published by Simon & Schuster. The talk was recorded during Governor Tugwell's residence at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. This is Alec Hoffman speaking from the center.